Hello and welcome back. Once again, I'm your instructor, Lukas, and today we'll be looking at the differences between students and professionals when it comes to revision, as well as reviewing the various techniques available, drawn from Chapter 4, Revision, in the textbook I wrote, College Composition and Reading, Information and Strategies. Revision is a marvelous opportunity. One of the disadvantages of speech is that as soon as you say something out loud and it's heard, that's it. There's no chance to make it better or change it, except by adding on, correcting yourself by saying something like, "What I meant was." On the other hand, one of the great things about the written word is that it can be carefully crafted and gradually improved before being presented to the world. Almost all of the professionally published writing you have ever seen has been heavily revised, and this opportunity for refinement and improvement should not be lost by a limited view that equates revision with grammatical proofreading. To help you discover a new way of thinking about revision, I want to discuss the study that was done on the differences between students and experts when it comes to revision, so that you can learn how to utilize more of the strategies and information that the experts have. However, let's begin by looking at the study's definition of what revising actually is. They decided that revision is actually a sequence of changes initiated by cues which occur continuously. Let's take a moment to look closely at some parts of that definition. First, revision is a sequence of changes. That means it isn't just a random change here or there, but a systematic set of changes that happen in a certain order and are meant to accomplish something specific. Secondly, it is initiated by cues. A cue is a hint, a clue, or a sign, which means that you have to recognize them in order to be able to make the changes. So then, being able to recognize the cues to revise is a big part of being effective. It also accounts for many of the differences between experts and student revisers, due to the fact that the experts are aware of many more possible signs or clues that a certain revision is necessary. Finally, revision occurs continually. Though we often think of it as something that we do at the end, revision is really something that you're doing throughout, anytime you delete a sentence you just wrote or stop to fix a misspelled word. For part of the study, students and professional writers were asked what they called what they did to an essay after the first draft and how they did it. Their answers can be illuminating, and we'll be looking at a few of them in a moment. However, before we do that, let's take a look at how the study classified the methods you could use for revision in order to use them when examining the responses. First, the study authors identified 4 basic operations you could carry out during revision. You could add material, you could delete material, you could substitute or replace material, or you could reorder it. Further, they identified 4 levels at which you could carry out each of these actions. You could add, delete, substitute individual words, phrases, sentences, or even entire themes or underlying ideas. Keep this idea of levels and operations in mind as we look at some of the responses on the next slide. Here are a few things that the students have to say. Listen to the quotes, thinking about what levels and operations they're working with. Reviewing. Reviewing means just using better words and eliminating words that are not needed. I go over and change words around. Reviewing. I just review every word and make sure that everything is worded right. I see if I am rambling. I see if I can put a better word in or leave one out. Usually when I've read what I've written, I say to myself, that word is so bland or so trite, and then I go and get my thesaurus. Marking out. I don't use the word rewriting because I only write one draft, and the changes that I make are made on top of the draft. The changes that I make are usually just marking out words and putting different ones in. Now, contrast that with what the experts say. Rewriting. It's a matter of looking at the kernel of what I've written, the content, and then thinking about it, responding to it, making decisions, and actually restructuring it. Rewriting. Rewriting means on one level, finding the argument, and on another level, language changes to make the argument more effective. I have learned from experience that I have to keep writing the first draft until I figure out what I want to say. Then in a second draft, I begin to see the structure of the argument and how all the various sub-arguments which are buried beneath the surfaces of all those sentences are related. As you could likely see, the students were concentrating on word level changes to the exclusion of all else. Nor were they using all of the operations, focusing primarily on deletion and substitution. Now, there's nothing wrong with word level changes. Indeed, they're an important part of revision. However, if you think about the possibilities presented, it's incomplete. If there are 4 operations, each of which can be carried out at 4 different levels, there are 16 different ways you could revise, from word level addition to theme level reordering. However, the students are only using 2. This means that their revision process will be incomplete. In addition, the students concentrate on words, but in reality, ideas are the building blocks of communication. After all, a clear, organized paper with grammar issues is likely to be received better than a confusing, mixed-up paper with no grammar problems. Your success or failure usually has to do with your ideas and organization more than your word choice or grammar, and merely checking for mechanical errors ignores the developmental possibilities of revision. Some useful conclusions that can be drawn from examining the experts' responses as well. First, in contrast to the students, the experts used all the levels and operations at different times in their revision process. In addition, another interesting distinction is that the students seem to view their first drafts as essentially final drafts that just need a little sprucing up or grammatical checking. On the other hand, the experts, who have much more reason to be confident in their rough drafts, seem to feel that they were little more than free writes to be mined for ideas to put into an overall structure that's discovered in the process of writing the first draft. The professional writers saw revision as a place to figure things out, to hone the ideas and shape them. That is, the experts saw revision as a process of discovery. You can use your first draft to discover what you're saying, and then use that to establish your organization, instead of restricting yourself to looking for fancier words and punctuation errors. Finally, one of the most important lessons to learn from the responses of the experts is that they revise in cycles. Rather than reading it over once, they look it over several times with a different goal in mind each time. To put it another way, each time they start a new revision cycle, they're looking for a different type of cue or sign, signaling a particular type of change that needs to be made. All of these insights can be helpful to you in creating a more effective process of revision. For now, let's look at revising in cycles in more detail. As was implied a moment ago, revising in cycles has many advantages. An important benefit is that it improves your focus and accuracy by helping you notice more of the cues or hints for revision that needs to happen. If you only read through a paper once, and you're looking for topic sentences, and word choice, and commas, and misspellings, and connections to thesis, and explanations, and focus, and, you're going to be overwhelmed, and you'll be able to more accurately locate the particular types of cues that you are concentrating on if you look for each one in a different cycle. There are 2 basic overall types of revision cues that you can look for: global and local. The first, called global revision or editing, concentrates on large issues like connecting and developing ideas, and deals mostly with theme or sentence level revisions. The second, called local revision or proofreading, concentrates on word or phrase level revisions, often including a focus on grammar and spelling as well as individual word choice. Several examples of revising in cycles are shown in the textbook. One has 3 cycles, 2 global and 1 local, and the other has 8 cycles, 4 global and 4 local. While I don't expect that many students will actually read through their essays 8 different times to revise them, I do think this gives you a good insight not only into the fact that different numbers and types of cycles can work for different people and in different situations, but also into the types of cycles that you might have. Generally, between 3 and 5 cycles strikes the perfect balance between a thorough process and one that you're actually willing to do. Make sure that you've included at least 1 global and 1 local type cycle when you determine your own ideal set of cycles. I also advise doing the local cycles at the end, since the global cycles will likely include some large changes, and there's no need to go over a paragraph with a fine-tooth comb if you end up realizing the entire paragraph needs to be deleted. I hope you take the information about cycles and the insights from the studies and use them to make your own revision process more focused and effective. There are many specific revision techniques out there to help draw attention to the different types of changes that might need to be made. In the rest of this lecture, I'm going to call attention to a few in particular that you might find useful. The first is something called a reverse outline. An outline is something you make before you've written the paper, but a reverse outline is something you do to a draft that already exists. Instead of writing out what you plan will be the points and organization, you record what's actually there. For every paragraph, you write a sentence or a phrase that captures the point of the paragraph. This can help you discover when a paragraph has no point or when it has several, as well as helping you to evaluate how connected those points are to the thesis and the order they're given in. Another way is to separate the two parts of the paragraph, with the topic on one side and the argument on the other. This is particularly useful if you end up just writing the topic when you meant to write the point of the paragraph, which is the topic plus the argument. Regardless of how you do it, the point of a reverse outline is to end up with a list of bullet points that describe the paragraph or essay. Then you can use that skeleton or outline of your existing paper to see how the pieces fit together and whether they do. When you're creating the bullet point for each paragraph, you want to make sure to stay brief. If you cannot keep it short, it may mean that the paragraph has more than one point and needs to be separated into two or more. Let's take a look at how this might work. To illustrate how this works, let's take a look at an example paragraph to see how we might turn it into a bullet point for a reverse outline. The paragraph reads, "The most common misconception is that nuclear power plants are dangerous. The opposite is true. Nuclear plants are distinctly safer than any of the other types of major power sources used in America today. In a 1997 study comparing accident statistics for primary energy production sources, including the mining and transporting of fuel, it was found that the most dangerous source of power was coal plants. The study shows that between the years of 1970 and 1992 worldwide, there were only 59 deaths related to the production of nuclear power. As a comparison, in that same period of time, there were 1,200 deaths related to natural gas plants, 4,000 deaths related to hydropower plants, and 6,400 deaths related to coal power plants. These statistics clearly show how much safer nuclear power production is in comparison with other types of power production. I invite you to pause the video for a moment and think about how you would boil this down to a single point that describes the topic and the argument of the paragraph. When you're ready, press play to see one possibility. One way we could describe this paragraph for a reverse outline would be to say, nuclear power is safer than other sources, not more dangerous. Hopefully this example helped to give you a better idea about how to create a reverse outline. Another method to make sure that you're staying on track is creating equivalent chains of meaning. The organization of a written work includes two elements: the order in which you've chosen to present the different parts of your discussion or argument, and the relationships you construct between those parts. Emphasizing those relationships and connections by coming back to key words, phrases, or ideas, creating a chain of linked text, is one way of strengthening these relationships. It also helps keep your reader both focused and on track, and makes reading and understanding easier. Equivalency chains do this by making it clear when things connect, which is one of the keys to good writing and speaking. We'll look at some examples of this from famous speeches in the past on the next few slides. There are a few different ways to create an equivalency chain. The first is to simply repeat the key words or phrases throughout the work so that it's clear they are the main ones. You can also use parallelism, which is constructing sentences so that the first half echoes the second half, or so that a sentence repeats a structure from an earlier sentence. In addition, so that you stay focused without getting repetitive, you can use synonyms, other words that mean the same thing, and pronouns such as these or they to connect back to a person, place, or thing discussed earlier. Let's take a look at some examples of equivalency chains from a few famous works in United States history. Our first example comes from a piece of literature which is often studied, an open letter that Martin Luther King Jr. wrote from a Birmingham jail defending the strategy of nonviolent resistance to racism in response to a published letter condemning his actions. It became an important text for the American Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, and it showcases many of King's literary skills, including the practice of building chains of equivalent meaning. In part, the letter reads, "In your statement, you assert that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. But is this a logical assertion? Isn't this like condemning a robbed man because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? Isn't this like condemning Socrates because his unswerving commitment to truth and his philosophical inquiries precipitated the act by the misguided populace in which they made him drink hemlock? Isn't this like condemning Jesus because of his unique God consciousness and never-ceasing devotion to God's will precipitated the evil act of crucifixion?" You can see he has used several of the strategies for building chains of equivalent meaning presented on the previous slide. For example, he has repeated his key words and phrases about the unfairness of condemning people for others' reactions to them. You can see the pink word precipitate and the purple word condemn running throughout this section. He also uses parallelism with his repetition of "isn't this like condemning" with increasingly sympathetic and admirable subjects, starting with a robbed man whom we might feel pity for, moving on to Socrates whom we might respect, and ending with Jesus, whom the religious leaders he was writing to regarded as the most admirable person in history. The repetition of the first line reinforces what's being said and draws readers in, while creating a link between the actions of protesters such as King to the actions of Socrates and Jesus himself. Let's take a look at another example from an even more famous speech in American history, the Gettysburg Address. Abraham Lincoln's speech at Gettysburg is one of the most famous and iconic in American history, and part of his rhetorical power comes from his mastery of strategies such as chains of equivalency. I'll read a section of the speech, and then we can spend some time unpacking all the ways in which we can see equivalency chains in action. Part of the Gettysburg Address went as follows. "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they give the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." Let's take a moment to look at what is going on in this complex passage. It begins with paired repetitions and opposites that juxtapose us versus them, meaning the participants in the dedication ceremony versus those who fought and died in the Battle of Gettysburg. These are marked with a dark bluish-gray color. The light blue highlights how he is using the opposite ideas of remembering, forgetting, and doing, saying, while his repetition of the idea of complete devotion is marked in navy blue. He also contrasts the ideas of living and birth versus death throughout, noted in dark pink. The highlighting in the different color shows how he is picking up on the same ideas throughout. His focus on not letting the deaths go to waste by bringing a new way of life is reinforced by the chain of equivalency that runs throughout the section. Lincoln also asks his audience to be dedicated to what he calls, quote, "the great task remaining before us," end quote, which he sets up as a parallel series of "that" clauses, which are marked in light purple. By repeating the structure, he ties together all the things that he's asking people to do. Copy the soldiers by being devoted, make sure they didn't die in vain, bring in a new freedom, and protect the idea of democracy. He also strengthens his speech with the parallelism of the repetition of the "it is rather" structure, marked in dark purple. I invite you to pause the video and take a few minutes to look at the various words of a particular color to really see how the repetition of words and ideas help to make this both effective and memorable. Now, these examples should also have shown you how having colors to draw your attention to different aspects of writing makes those aspects easier to see and evaluate. This carries over into another revision method, which we'll be looking at next, color blocking, also known as color coding. One strategy for revision that can be especially useful for visually oriented people can be that of color blocking, which is just a strategic use of a highlighter, or the highlighting function on your computer. This method has several advantages, especially since there are different ways that you can use color blocking, as we'll see on the next slide. One is that it creates a visual representation of your essay, allowing you to see the elements separately. Being able to see the structure and parts represented by the different colors helps you to understand it better. You can also use color blocking as a way of seeing how each element of the paragraph is contributing to the overall paper, or whether it actually is contributing. Finally, it can help you make sure that you're checking all of the important elements in your revision by giving you a way to see what you have or have not checked. Let's take a look at some specific ways you can use color blocking. One way that you can use color blocking is as an organizational aid. It can be a way to make sure that you're grouping similar ideas. This method can be especially useful if you like to do an idea draft, where you simply write out a draft as your method of brainstorming. In this type of a draft, you often have ideas that you come back to at different times. So if you create general categories of topics and assign each a color, then you can highlight each sentence or section depending on which idea or topic it's focused on, and then group all ideas of the same color together to untangle it all. Another approach is to simply start reading the draft, and for each topic you run into as you read through, start a new color and highlight everything that's about that topic in that color, making a note of what the topic is. Then put all the items in green together, all the items in blue together, etc. However, that is far from the only way that you can use color blocking. Another popular method is to use it in conjunction with pie. You can highlight anything that is a claim or point in one color, such as yellow, information in another one like blue, and explanations in a third color, such as red, looking to make sure that all paragraphs contain all the colors. You can also see what order they're in, the point should be first, and make sure that there is only one point per paragraph. Another common way to make use of colors is to use them to check off what you've already done. If you make a list of things that you want to check in your revision, you can use colors to mark what has been done. For instance, if you want to check to make sure that your commas are all correct, you can highlight each comma as you check it to make sure that it is correct. There are many other ways that you can use color blocking as well. Don't be afraid to get creative. Do you know anyone who tends to change the subject suddenly during a conversation? I do, and it's disorienting. It seems like a sudden thought pops into their head and they blurt it out without any sort of closure to the original topic or introduction to the next. Writing presents the same challenge. As one subject or idea concludes, the next subject or concept must be introduced smoothly. And that is what transitions are for. Transitions indicate time, examples, exceptions, comparison, and sequences, plus a whole lot more. Just now I repeated transitions, for example, from the previous paragraph to hold the thought in your head and to remind you that we're still talking directly about transitions. Transitions help you to convey information clearly and concisely by establishing logical connections between sentences, paragraphs, and sections of your paper. Basically, transitions tell readers what to do with the information you present to them, providing the reader with directions for how to piece together your ideas into a logically coherent argument. Whether they are single words, short phrases, or entire sentences, transitions help readers see the connections or relationships between ideas, and, just as importantly, transitions also prevent sudden jarring mental leaps between sentences and paragraphs. They are not just verbal decorations that embellish your paper by making it sound or read better. They are words with particular meanings that tell the reader to think and react in a particular way to your ideas. By providing the reader with these important cues, transitions help readers understand the logic of how your ideas fit together. Transitions can accomplish all of this by clarifying relationships, linking major sections of the text, conveying sequence, signaling shifts in time or place, showing relationships, especially cause and effect, and temporal or time-based relationships, and by creating a natural flow or progression through logical organization and structure. Transition words are essential since they not only connect ideas, but can also introduce a shift, contrast, or opposition, emphasis or agreement, purpose, result or conclusion, and more. And one handy aspect of transitions is that you can go back and add them in after you write the paper, adding words like however or therefore, or even whole sentences bridging between ideas. We'll look at how that might work after we finish up looking at revision techniques in the next slide. The organization of your written work includes two elements. One, the order in which you've chosen to present the different parts of your discussion or argument, and two, the relationships you construct between those parts. Transitions cannot substitute for good organization, but they can make your organization clearer and easier to follow. On the other hand, if you think your organization itself needs adjusting, there are a few more methods that we have not yet discussed that you can use to correct your organization. One useful method is the copy and paste outline. This method consists of opening a blank document and then copying and pasting the thesis statement and the topic sentence for each paragraph into a new document. The resulting paragraph should make sense. The thesis statement should clearly be the point, with the other sentences giving reasons or supports connected to the thesis. There obviously won't be much detail or support, but the arguments should be clear and clearly connected to the thesis. Putting them next to each other also makes it easy to see whether or not they actually connect. This also gives you a chance to evaluate the thesis to make sure it's appropriate for the assignment and is an actual argument, rather than just a factual statement that merely implies an argument. Finally, you can evaluate your topic sentences to make sure they have both the topic and the argument, not just the topic, and that they connect back to the thesis. Another method for evaluating and revising your organization itself is something we talked about previously when discussing paragraphs: sentence sequencing. Sentence sequencing can help you to evaluate the flow of your paragraphs and whether you're staying too general, and is explained in detail in the chapter and video on paragraphing. Basically, assigning numbers can show if connections are missing, plus it gives you information about the essay's organization in a concrete and easy to evaluate form. It can be especially useful with those who work with numbers more easily than language. A final tip is to begin with information known to the reader, either because it's common or because it's something you've already discussed earlier. Start with what they know. As we'll see when discussing how we understand and remember things, the most effective way to learn and understand new information is to begin with what is already known. Now that we've talked about many different methods for revision, let's take a look at how they might be applied by looking at an example. Here is a paragraph as a student might have written it. It reads, "The ancient Egyptians were masters of preserving dead people's bodies by making mummies of them. Mummies several thousand years old have been discovered nearly intact. The skin, hair, teeth, toenails, and facial features of the mummies were evident. It is possible to diagnose the disease they suffered in life, such as smallpox, arthritis, and nutritional deficiencies. The process was remarkably effective. Sometimes apparent were the fatal afflictions of the dead people. A middle-aged king died from a blow to the head, and polio killed a child king. Mummification consisted of removing the internal organs, applying natural preservatives inside and out, and then wrapping the body in layers of bandages." Now, there is nothing glaringly wrong with that paragraph, but it could flow much better and be easier to read. Take a moment and pause the video to think about what changes you might make to it before we go on to the next slide to see some possible revisions. Here you can see a revised version of this same paragraph. We'll be comparing the two side by side in the next slide, but here you can see how we've added some parallel structure with the repetition of things being still there in purple. Equivalency chains with the repetition of mummification and its synonyms and pronouns in blue, and the addition of some transitions, which are bold and underlined. The new version reads, "The ancient Egyptians were masters of preserving dead people's bodies by making mummies of them. Basically, mummification consisted of removing the internal organs, applying natural preservatives inside and out, and then wrapping the body in layers of bandages. This process was remarkably effective. In fact, mummies several thousand years old have been discovered nearly intact, and the skin, hair, teeth, toenails, and facial features of the mummies are still evident. Even more amazing, their diseases in life, such as smallpox, arthritis, and nutritional deficiencies, are still diagnosable. Their fatal afflictions are still apparent. A middle-aged king died from a blow to the head, and a child king died from polio." You can see how the addition of these words and phrases have helped to make the organization clearer and easier to follow, especially when we look at the two versions side by side. As you can see, transitions have been added, some of the sentences have been rearranged to put similar information together, and chains of coherence were created by referring back to the central ideas. The improved version uses synonyms like there, earlier, and ties things together rather than just giving new information without tying back to the previous information. I invite you to take a few moments to pause the video and look not only at what the differences are, but what effect they are having on the overall feeling of the piece. Do you see any other improvements that could be made? Thank you for watching. I hope that this overview was helpful and illuminating and has helped you come to a deeper understanding of the possibilities of revision. Please don't hesitate to contact me with any question you may have about the material. I am always happy to help.